Today, let's talk about the required reserve ratio and how it influences bank lending. The required reserve ratio is going to determine the money multiplier, and the money multiplier determines the maximum amount of deposit creation that is possible. Banks are able to create deposits, and deposits are considered money. The money multiplier is the inverse of the required reserve ratio, 1 divided by the required reserve ratio. So if you look at the required reserve ratio and the money multiplier, you'll see a pattern. A 5% required reserve ratio, banks only have to keep 5% of every deposit, leads to a money multiplier of 20. A 10% required reserve ratio leads to a money multiplier of 10. If you raise the required reserve ratio to 10%, the money multiplier drops to 5. If banks have to keep 50% of every deposit as reserves, the money multiplier drops to 2. And if banks have to keep 100% of every deposit as reserves, they're not able to create any new bank deposits. The multiplier is only 1. So let's look at the actual amount of deposits that banks can create. With a money multiplier of 20 and an increase in bank reserves of $100,000, the maximum amount of deposits that banks could possibly create would be $2 million. A money multiplier of 10 and the same increase in reserves would create $1 million of new deposits. A money multiplier of only 5 and the same change in reserves would create only $500,000 in deposits. Remember, the money multiplier works both ways. So if you have a drop in bank reserves, a decrease in bank reserves, that's going to reduce total deposits. And if there is a 100% required reserve ratio, then an increase in $100,000 in the reserves just adds $100,000 to your balance sheet. You don't get deposit expansion. So clearly, banks want to make as many loans as possible, so they prefer a low required reserve ratio, and they want to expand total deposits as much as they can. Keep in mind, when you're working money and banking problems, the answer can always be found by thinking about what the impact on bank lending is going to be. A lower required reserve ratio, banks hold a smaller amount of each deposit, leads to increased lending and an increased money multiplier, which leads to more deposit creation, which is an increase in the money supply. A higher required reserve ratio, which banks don't like, means they can lend less money and the money multiplier is smaller. They can only create a smaller number of deposits and a smaller amount of increase in the money supply. It is possible for this to even be negative. Okay, that you could actually decrease the money supply if the bank is losing reserves. It's important to understand how the required reserve ratio, the money multiplier, and total deposits are all related, and it's important to understand the role of bank lending.